On October 8, 1985, a 58-year-old farmer from Wyoming, while talking to his neighbor on the phone, noticed someone moving in the distance on his property. All she said was, "This is my land. Whoever they are, I have a right to know." After that, the neighbor heard a rifle being cocked. That was the last conversation. The next morning, his truck was parked in the middle of a dirt road with the door open. The rifle lay on the seat, and only one round had been fired. And 50 yards from the truck, a perfectly circular patch of scorched earth, the soil melted into a glass-like state. Footprints from heavy work boots led to this circle and stopped right at the very edge. Harold Briggs had vanished, as if he'd been cut out of the world. Harold Edward Briggs was born in 1927 to a family of cattle ranchers. His father died in the early 1950s, leaving him 400 acres of pasture, a small house, and a bank loan. By that time, Harold had already returned from Korea. He was drafted into the Marine Corps in 1950, was discharged in 1953, and came back to Converse County. He never discussed what exactly happened between those dates with anyone. In '62, he married Alice Murphy from Douglas. They were married for 21 years. In 1983, Alice died of pancreatic cancer. Harold was left alone. No children, no close relatives, only his second cousin Dennis Briggs in Denver, whom they saw once every few years, exchanged Christmas cards with, and talked about nothing else. The farm was located about 15 miles northwest of Douglas, a small town with a few churches, a pharmacy, a hardware store, and the Converse County Sheriff's Office. Harold's closest neighbor was Walter Crane, about 2 miles to the east down a dirt road. They had known each other for 35 years. Not in the sense that they were next-door friends or went fishing together. It meant they knew who to call at 1:30 in the morning, and that person would come without asking any questions. Neighbors and acquaintances describe Harold almost identically. Taciturn, dependable, prone neither to panic nor to complaining. Walter Crane said simply in an interview with a local newspaper, "The kind of man who'll fix your fence without asking if you need help." From Korea, Harold brought back one thing he always carried with him: a Zippo lighter with a faded Marine Corps emblem. Jackets came and went, trucks came and went. The lighter remained. Harold never went anywhere without his lighter. That meant he'd left in a hurry. That meant every second counted. The last normal weeks of his life began in late September 1985. Autumn came early to Converse County that year. By the 20th, frosts were already setting in at night. The grass had turned to dark straw, and the west wind whipped dust along the dirt roads. That was when Harold first noticed it. At night, from about 1 to 3 o'clock, a hum would begin to sound over the farm. Low, monotonous, steady, without rising or falling. It wasn't the roar of an engine, the vibration of a pipeline, or the sound from Highway 25, which was about 9 miles away. Just a hum, as if something huge and heavy were hovering in the air and working. The cattle reacted immediately. The cows huddled into a tight group by the pen fence and stood there until morning, pressed close together. For an experienced rancher, this in itself was an alarming sign. Herefords don't huddle together for no reason. On October 1st, around 1:30 in the morning, Harold stepped out onto the porch and saw the light. White, motionless, without flickering and without any color fringes at the edges. It hung over the distant pasture at a height of about 150 feet. It didn't blink. It didn't move. Harold stood and watched. Later, he would say he timed it for 5 minutes. Then the light shot straight up, rapidly and directly, and vanished. At that very moment, the hum fell silent, a sound Harold had by then ceased to notice, just as one ceases to notice the hum of a refrigerator. Only when it vanished did the silence become audible. On October 2nd, Walter Crane drove up to the farm to return the hydraulic jack he'd borrowed a couple of weeks earlier. Walter immediately noticed that something was wrong with Harold. Not exactly frightened, more composed, tense, like a man who hasn't yet decided whether to speak aloud about what's troubling him. In the end, he told him about the humming, about the light, about the livestock. Walter suggested the first thing that came to mind: the military. Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, about 170 miles to the northeast. Strategic bombers are stationed there. Exercises are held there. Harold shook his head and said, "I've heard planes my whole life. This is something else. It hovers in one spot and hums." Planes don't hover. Helicopters hover, but a helicopter makes a different sound, and you can hear it from several miles away. What Harold heard at night wasn't moving. On October 4th, around 8 p.m., he called Walter again. The light returned, closer than the first time. Harold said he would go take a look. He called back about an hour later. By the time he reached the pasture, the light had vanished. No traces. Only the cows by the eastern fence, which didn't want to go out into the open space in the center of the field. On October 6th, Harold drove to Douglas and stopped by the sheriff's office. For a man of his temperament, this was a serious step. He wasn't the type to complain. On duty that day was Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison, about 40 years old, who had served in the position for over 10 years. He listened attentively, wrote it down in the report, without irony and without enthusiasm. And he mentioned something important. Over the past few weeks, several local residents had already called about similar incidents. Strange lights over the fields, a humming sound at night, disturbed animals. With no incidents and no evidence, there was nothing to be done. Harold thanked him and left. October 7th passed quietly. No humming, no lights. The livestock behaved normally. Harold, it seemed, allowed himself to think that it was all over. October 8th began like a typical autumn day. In the morning, inspecting the livestock, repairing the fence at the north pen, lunch alone in the kitchen. The day was clear and cold, with a strong west wind. After lunch, Harold worked in the barn. Tools were left laid out there, and he had started repairing the tow rope. Everything indicated that he planned to return and continue. Around 9 o'clock that evening, he called Walter. Walter Crane later described this call several times, to investigators, journalists, and at hearings at the state sheriff's office. And each time he said the same thing. Harold's voice sounded frightened. Not agitated, not irritated, frightened. And Harold Briggs, a veteran, a man who had seen war and run the farm alone for 20 years after his wife's death, was not a man to be easily frightened. He spoke in short bursts, quickly. In the background, there was some kind of vibration, an unnatural low hum. The rumbling had started even before dark. The light hangs right over the pasture, about 300 yards from the house. The cows are panicking. My head is buzzing from the vibration. Then he said, "There's no point in calling Frank until there's a body or damage. I'll grab my rifle and head down to the lower pasture. Give me an hour, Walt. If I don't call back by 10, dial Frank at the station and get over here." Walter tried to stop him. Harold had already hung up. The phone remained silent until 11 o'clock that night. Walter called himself. Long beeps. He tried again. Same thing. The phone was in the cradle. Harold just wasn't picking up. Walter decided to wait until morning. He didn't want to raise a false alarm. Later, that decision would torment him, even though there was no reasonable basis for reproaching himself. On October 9th, at 5:45 a.m., he drove out to the farm. The sky was just beginning to lighten, that bluish hour when the horizon is barely distinguishable from the sky. A dirt road, just over 2 miles. He got there quickly. There was no truck by the house. He went in through the unlocked back door. There was a cup of coffee on the kitchen table. It was half drunk, a distinctive dark streak from the liquid on the inside wall, which had sat there for several hours and evaporated at the edge. The telephone receiver lay on the cradle. Everything was in its place in the living room. The armchair, a stack of farm journal magazines on the side table, worn-out shoes by the entrance, the ones he took off when he entered the house and placed by the threshold. He put on his work boots instead. No note, no mess, no signs of a hurried departure. The owner had left and not returned. Walter got into the car and drove down the dirt road toward the lower pasture. About a mile from the house, he saw a Ford F-250. The blue pickup was parked at an angle in the middle of the road. Not parked, abandoned. The driver's door was wide open. The left headlight glowed with a faint yellow light. The battery had nearly died overnight. The engine was off, the keys in the ignition. The driver's side window was rolled down. Walter stopped, got out, and walked over to the cab. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Sour, pungent, and lingering in the upholstery. That's what burnt gunpowder smells like. Once you've smelled it, you'll never mistake it for anything else. A Remington .30-06 hunting rifle lay on the driver's seat. The barrel was pointed toward the passenger door, the way people place a weapon when they want it close at hand, but not threatening. On the floor of the cab, right by the pedals, was a single brass shell casing. Just one. He had fired once. Through the open window, judging by the fact that the glass wasn't broken, in the glove compartment, registration papers, a map of Wyoming, a pack of Marlboros, and a Zippo lighter with a Marine Corps emblem, lying right on top of the pack as if tossed there at the last moment. There were no signs of a struggle. Everything lay exactly as things are left when you jump out of a car in a matter of seconds and don't plan on returning for a long time. Walter stepped out of the cab and looked out into the field. The dawn air was cold and still. The grass along the road stood silent. And then he saw the tracks. Heavy work boots, the grooved tread Walter had seen many times in the mud by the corral gate. The tracks led from the open driver's door straight into the field. The ground was frozen solid and held the footprints well. Walter counted the steps. 10 yards, 12, 15. The stride was wide and even. Harold was walking fast, but not running. And then the tracks ended, not by a ditch, not by a bush, not by any obstacle. The last print of the right boot was literally cut in half. One half of the footprint was normal, clear, deep, while the other half lay on the edge of a scorched circle, melted and pressed into a dark, glassy substance along with the soil. It was as if whatever had scorched the ground had simultaneously destroyed half of the last footprint, along with the person who left it. The circle was about 10 feet in diameter. The grass inside was not trampled or uprooted, but rather flattened to the ground, as if by pressure applied evenly from above across the entire area. At the edges, the grass was bent outward, symmetrically, all around the perimeter, without a single exception. In the center, the top layer of soil, about an inch deep, had melted and solidified into a dark, smooth crust. Walter crouched down and tested it with his fingernail. It didn't scratch. Smooth, shiny, like polished glass. There were no traces beyond the circle, in any direction. Absolutely none. Walter Crane returned to the pickup truck, walked along the road to the farm, entered the house through the back door, picked up the phone, and dialed 911. It was 6:12 a.m. on October 9, 1985. From that moment on, the case of Harold Edward Briggs' disappearance became official. It has yet to be explained. Frank Morrison arrived at Briggs's farm at 7:20 a.m. With him was a young patrolman, Davis, 25 years old, less than a year on the job. They examined the truck in silence. Morrison took a Polaroid of the cab, the position of the rifle, the shell casing on the floor, the keys in the ignition, the open glove compartment. He jotted it down in his notebook. Then he followed the tracks into the field. He stood at the edge of the circle and stared down at it for a long time. He took out a tape measure. He measured the diameter at 3 different points: 8 feet 9 inches, 8 feet 8, 8 feet 10, an almost perfect circle. The deviation was no more than an inch around the entire perimeter. I dropped to one knee and examined the spot where Harold's last footprint met the edge of the scorched ground. He stood up and said to Davis, "Take pictures of everything." Davis used up 2 rolls of Polaroid film. In one photograph, which would later be reproduced in several publications, the morning light can be seen falling on the surface of the vitrified ground. It glistens. The grass at the edges of the circle is bent outward in a straight line. Every dry blade points from the center toward the periphery. If you look at the photograph without context, your first thought is, someone placed something heavy and round here, heated it to the limit, and removed it. But nothing heavy was standing here. No traces of supports, legs, or runners. Just smooth, fused soil with a flat bottom. Dog handler Ray Dietmar arrived around 9 in the morning with his German Shepherd, Duke. They let the dog sniff Harold's jacket from the passenger seat. Duke picked up the scent immediately and pulled confidently. 30 yards from the car, he was practically running. At the edge, abruptly, as if he'd stumbled upon something invisible. He began darting back and forth along the edge, right, left, right again, whimpering, sniffing, rubbing his nose with his paw, as if something were burning his receptors. The trail didn't lead in any particular direction. It simply vanished at a single point, right at the edge of the scorched ground, where half of the last boot print had been cut off by that edge. Dietmar tried to lead Duke around the circle to go around in an arc. The dog resisted, pulling the leash backward. In his report, Dietmar wrote dryly, "The scent trail breaks off at the edge of the anomalous area. There is no continuation in any direction across the ground." The search party spread out within a mile's radius. Old sheds, a dried-up stream bed to the south, an abandoned shepherd's hut 2 miles to the north. In the hut, they found an old army thermos, 2 unlabeled tin cans, and a mouse nest in the corner. No sign of Harold Briggs. On October 10th, Converse County Sheriff Earl Patterson expanded the search area. Patterson, a stocky 50-year-old with a reputation for being meticulous and taciturn, immediately realized that the case went beyond a standard search. By evening, about 30 people were involved in the operation. Local farmers, residents of Douglas, and Forest Service employees. They combed the area within a 5-mile radius. The result was the same. On October 11th, volunteer Billy Henderson, a 52-year-old local farmer, was inspecting an old barn at the edge of a pasture about 200 yards from where the truck had been parked. He went inside, looked around the corner where small tools used to be stored, and when he turned toward the west wall, he saw 3 holes. Round, about 3 inches in diameter each, about 5 feet above the ground, arranged in a straight horizontal line with about a foot between their centers. The edges were charred, dark, and caked like burnt clay. They did not crumble to the touch. All 3 were through holes. On the opposite eastern wall, 3 dark patches of charred wood, not burned through but deeply blackened. Something had passed through the western wall and stopped in the eastern one. Henderson went outside and called for Morrison. Morrison took a metal probe and inserted it into one of the holes. It did not lie horizontally, it was at a slight angle, pointing downward. He went outside and estimated the direction. If the line were extended across the field for 180 yards, it would end exactly at the scorched circle and touch it at a height of about 20 feet above the ground. In other words, the source that had left these 3 scorched holes was in the air above the circle, not on the ground. Morrison told Davis to measure the distance, exactly 180 yards. County Fire Department specialist Daniel Wood examined the holes that same day. His conclusion was brief. The wood was burned through by a focused heat source, not drilled through or scorched by an open flame from the outside. The temperature of the impact was over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The circular shape of the holes rules out any known tool or projectile. At the end, Wood added by hand that this was the first case in his 20 years of work where he could not identify the source. On October 14th, the first response arrived from the State Crime Lab in Cheyenne. Soil samples from the crop circle were taken on the very first day. The basic conclusion was brief. The temperature at the center of the circle ranged from 1,500 to 1,700 degrees Celsius. For comparison, a burning tree reaches about 600 degrees. Steel begins to melt at around 1,300 degrees. 1,700 degrees is the temperature of an industrial furnace or a brief plasma discharge. The nature of the source is unknown. Additional research has been forwarded to specialized laboratories. On October 17th, Patterson sent out official requests. Response from Air Force Headquarters, Ellsworth Air Force Base. On the night of October 8th to 9th, no exercises or flights were conducted in the Converse County area. All aircraft movements were recorded in the logs. The response arrived 3 days later, brief, to the point, and without follow-up questions. Response from the FBI Regional Office. Denied. No evidence of a federal crime. recommended to continue the investigation at the state level. According to Morrison, Patterson read it twice and put it in a folder without saying a word. On October 22nd, two investigators from the Wyoming State Sheriff's Office, Carl Brennan and Linda Foster, arrived from Cheyenne. They spent 2 days at the scene. They inspected the corral, the barn, the truck, and the house. They took statements from Walter Crane, Frank Morrison, Billy Henderson, and Dietmar. They left on the morning of the third day. The final report was 4 pages long and contained a single conclusion. The disappearance was classified as suspicious. Physical evidence confirms exposure to an unidentified source of extremely high heat. The origin of the source could not be determined. The body was not found. Murder has not been proven. The case remains open. This was the standard wording for cases that did not fit into any of the existing categories. Patterson knew it by heart. On October 12th, a brief note appeared in the local newspaper, the Douglas Budget. No details, no sensational headline. A local farmer was missing, and the police were conducting a search. That was enough to set the phones ringing at the newsroom. The first to call was Dorothy Wakefield, 54 years old, with a ranch 9 miles west of Briggs's farm. On the evening of October 8th, around 10 o'clock, she went out to feed her dog. In the east, low on the horizon, a bright white light hung, motionless, clear, without flickering. She watched it for about 2 minutes. Then, in a matter of seconds, the light shot straight up and vanished. She went inside and decided it must be the military. The second caller was Gary Simmons, 41 years old, a long-haul truck driver. That night he was driving on Highway 25, about 15 miles to the north. Around 11 o'clock at night, a bright white light flashed in the south. Not like headlights. The flash lasted less than a second, but lit up the entire area as if it were daytime. Simmons instinctively slammed on the brakes. The sky was completely clear. The third witnesses were the Kowalskis, Edward, 73, and Mary, 69, residents of Douglas. That same night, shortly before 11, they didn't so much hear the rumble as feel it. A low-frequency vibration rolled through the house. The glass in the sideboard rattled, and their teeth chattered. Edward would later say that the sound didn't travel through the air, but through the ground, as happens with a distant explosion or an earthquake, only without the tremor. It lasted 30 to 40 seconds. We went out onto the porch. The sky was clear. Nothing was visible. The neighbor's dog kept barking for another 10 minutes after the vibration stopped. Edward Kowalski told a reporter that at first he didn't want to call the newspaper. He thought it would look ridiculous. Then he decided it would be ridiculous to keep quiet. 3 independent witnesses from different locations within a 15-mile radius describing the same phenomenon between 10 p.m. and midnight. That's no longer a coincidence. Patterson entered their statements into the case file. All 3 pointed in the same direction, east, toward the lower pasture of the Briggs farm. Theories came and went, one after another. Voluntary disappearance. Patterson checked the farm's financial situation. There were almost no debts. The account at Douglas Bank, about $8,000, was untouched. No large withdrawals. Harold's documents were in the truck's glove compartment. The lighter was there too. People who leave on their own take their money and documents. Accident. The medical records showed normal results for key indicators. The area was combed within a 5-mile radius. All the old wells in the county were checked. Nothing. Cults. Patterson investigated this lead as well. None of the known lists contained Briggs's name. Walter Crane summed it up succinctly. Harold went to church 3 times in his entire life, at his own wedding and at other people's funerals. Every version seemed logical until the moment physical evidence was applied to it. A scorched circle, melted soil, 3 burn holes at an angle pointing to a source in the air, a dog that lost the trail in an open field. None of the theories explained all of this at once. By the end of October, people whom no one had invited began arriving at the farm, with homemade dosimeters, cameras, and stacks of MUFON magazines. Patterson ordered the strangers removed from the property and a guard posted. Dennis Briggs from Denver, Harold's only relative, arrived on October 12th, stayed for 2 days, looked at the circle, and asked Patterson what he thought. Patterson replied that it was too early to draw conclusions. Dennis left. The story spread beyond the county. A short article appeared in the Casper Star-Tribune. Several publications reprinted it, without sensationalism, simply as a story about a missing farmer and unexplained clues. In Douglas, opinions were divided. Some spoke of the military and secret tests. Others said that Harold had gone mad from loneliness and left on his own. Others said nothing, but for several weeks, farmers within a 10-mile radius avoided going out into the fields alone after dark. This was not discussed openly. By November, the search operations had been called off. The case remained open, no progress, no theories, no next steps. In mid-November, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. The return address was the Department of Geology at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. State Laboratory forensic scientist Thomas Parrish, dissatisfied with his own lab's capabilities, unofficially sent a few grams of caked soil from the center of the circle to an acquaintance in the geochemistry department. The response took just over a month. Iridium was detected in the samples. Not trace amounts, a significant concentration, many times higher than the background level for any rock in the region, plus several rare earth elements uncharacteristic of the geology of the converse area. Iridium occurs in significant concentrations in two contexts: meteoritic material and deep magmatic rocks. Neither is present here, nor could it be. A geochemist from Laramie, Professor David Collins, noted in a handwritten postscript at the end of his letter that his first thought was of a meteorite. But the form of the deposit completely rules this out. A meteorite impact leaves a crater with ejected soil around the perimeter and a funnel-shaped bottom profile. Here, the bottom is flat, a perfect circle with no ejecta. Collins wrote, "I cannot explain by what process these elements came to be in the surface soil layer in such a concentration. This does not correspond to any geological or anthropogenic scenario known to me." A parallel analysis of charred wood from the shed revealed the same anomalous elements, iridium in the structure of the charred wood, as if the heat source that burned through the wall had simultaneously sprayed these substances as it worked. The letter from Laramie went into the folder for Patterson. He read it, called Collins, and spoke for about 20 minutes. Then he hung up and sat at his desk for a long time. Morrison, who was in the room, asked what the professor had said. Patterson replied, "He said he doesn't know. This is the first time that hasn't made me feel any better." The case of the disappearance of Harold Edward Briggs was officially reclassified as unsolved in March 1986. The active phase of the investigation has been closed. The folder contained 112 pages, transcripts, Polaroid photos, lab reports, witness statements, a letter from Laramie, and not a single answer to the one question that mattered. Winter came early that year. In November, dry, heavy snow fell, covering the dirt roads and hiding the scorched circle beneath a white blanket. By January, people had stopped talking about the Briggs farm, not because they had forgotten, but because there was nothing new to say. Dennis Briggs hired a local farmer to look after the cattle. The cows were sold in March of the following year. The scorched circle remained. In the spring, when the snow melted, a few locals came to take a look. Grass had already begun to sprout around it, on the outside, but not inside. The glassy bottom lay untouched, smooth, dark, impenetrable. Rain hadn't washed it away. Frost hadn't cracked it. The case had been sitting in the archives for 18 years, until the day when an envelope with no return address landed on the desk of a man who knew nothing about it, and turned everything that seemed final upside down. In March 2003, Dennis Briggs received a package. He lived in Denver, worked as an accountant at a small construction firm, and the last time he'd thought about his uncle's disappearance was probably 3 years ago, when he'd once again inquired about the status of the case and received yet another standard reply. The package arrived by regular mail, with no return address. The postmark read Portland, Oregon. Inside was a worn, checkered school notebook, 48 pages filled with handwriting. Dennis recognized Harold's handwriting immediately. They rarely saw each other, but he had kept a few old letters. Large, angular letters, heavy pressure, almost no slant. Dennis called the Converse County Sheriff's Office that same day. There was a new sheriff there. Patterson had retired in '98. The case was assigned to Detective Brian Holloway, 38 years old, who knew about the Briggs case only from the case files. He arrived in Denver 2 days later, picked up the notebook, and sent it to the Cheyenne lab for handwriting analysis. 3 weeks later, the report came back. The handwriting most likely belonged to Harold Edward Briggs. The paper was American-made from the 1980s, and the ink came from a standard ballpoint pen from the same period. The notebook was not new. It had been written in a long time ago. Holloway forwarded the contents of the notebook to the state sheriff's office and requested a consultation with a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist read it and said that the structure of the text did not correspond to delirium or a hallucinatory disorder. It was too coherent, too concrete, with too many specific details that a person in a psychotic episode would not retain. This did not mean that what was written was true. It meant that the person who wrote it was of sound mind and was describing what he believed to be real. The notebook was not dated, but inside were indirect clues, mentions of the time of day, changes in light, physical sensations that could be arranged into a chronology. Holloway spent several days on this. He would later describe the result in his report as the most disturbing document of my entire career. Harold wrote that the first thing he remembered after getting out of the truck was the light, not the same white, unmoving light he had seen over the pasture for the past 2 weeks. A different one, emanating from everywhere at once, with no source, no shadows, no direction. The air glowed evenly from within, not blinding, just everywhere. He wrote that for the first few minutes, or what seemed like minutes to him, he just stood there and couldn't tell which way was up. There was no horizon. He didn't feel the ground beneath his feet, but he wasn't falling either. The hum that had been ringing in his head back in the car was different here. Not oppressive, but steady, like the background noise of a large building where the ventilation runs around the clock. Then walls appeared around him. He couldn't explain exactly how. They were just there at some point. Not wood, not concrete, not metal. The surface was smooth and slightly warm, like stone heated by the sun. He described the color as gray, but not gray. Something between gray and beige, shifting depending on the angle of view, with no pattern, no seams, no joints. One large room, he wrote that he tried to measure it in steps, about 30 feet long, about 20 feet wide. The ceiling was about 12 feet high, just as smooth, just the same color. The floor is warm, hard, and seamless. The lighting is uniform throughout, with no visible source. He saw no doors, no windows, no furniture, only at the far end something like a horizontal platform about knee-high, of the same texture as the walls. He wrote that he sat down on it because his legs wouldn't hold him up. The creatures didn't appear right away. At first, he simply sensed that someone was in the room. He didn't see or hear them, he just sensed them, the way you sense a person's presence in a dark room. Then he saw them. There were 3 of them. Harold described them at length and returned to the details several times, as if he wanted to make sure he wasn't mistaken. Height, about 5 feet, maybe a little less. Their build was slender, their arms disproportionately long relative to their torso. Their heads were larger than a human's, tilted backward. The eyes were large, with no visible whites. Dark, set slightly wider apart than a human's. There was no nose in the usual sense, only 2 narrow slits. The mouth was a thin line with almost no lips. The skin was pale, with a very slight grayish tint, hairless, with no visible pores. There was no clothing, but he could not determine the gender either. There were no signs by which this was possible. They did not speak. They made no sounds. But Harold wrote that somehow he understood, not words, not sentences, but something like a general meaning, a sense of intention. It was as if a thought were placed directly into his head, bypassing words. He wrote that it was worse than if they had spoken aloud, because he couldn't pretend he didn't understand. At first, he just sat on the platform. The beings were inside the room. Sometimes they came closer, looked, and then moved away. One of them once came right up close and stood there for about a minute. Harold wrote that there was no smell, no warmth, nothing at all coming from it, as if something were standing nearby that had form but no body, in the sense that a living being has a body. Then began what he described with the greatest difficulty. He was asked to lie down on the platform, not with words. He simply understood that this was what he had to do. He wrote that at first he refused. He sat there and didn't move. Then he realized he had no choice, not because he was physically forced, but because the will to resist quietly left him, like air from a chamber. He lay down. Objects appeared above him, small, of various shapes, some glowing. Some touched him, painlessly, but with a sensation he compared to feeling someone else's hand through several layers of thick fabric. There was pressure, but no actual contact. At some point, he stopped feeling his body. Not numbness, but specifically the absence of signals, as if the wires had been disconnected. He wrote that this was the most terrifying part. Not the pain, the silence inside. Then the light grew brighter. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was lying on the ground, not in the field by his truck. He was lying on a wooden floor inside an old building. Cracks in the floorboards, the smell of rotten wood and mice. Near total darkness, only a faint light from outside seeping through the cracks in the wall. He didn't immediately realize where he was. Then he stood up, went outside, and recognized the place. An abandoned shepherd's hut 2 miles north of his farm. He had been here several times in recent years, checking the fence on that side. He looked at his watch. 10 minutes past 1. He decided that about 3 hours had passed since he got out of the truck, that it was now the middle of the night on October 8th. He walked toward the farm, using the stars to guide him. The darkness was total, the ground uneven. He stumbled several times. The walk took about an hour. When he climbed to the crest of a small hill overlooking the lower pasture and the house, dawn was already breaking. The first gray streaks in the east. He looked down and stopped. There were cars parked by his house, several of them. He recognized Walter's pickup. He recognized the car with the flashing light, the sheriff. People were walking between the house and the dirt road. At the far end of the field, where he remembered his truck, there was movement too. Figures, flashlights. A dog on a leash was pulling a dog handler toward the field. He didn't understand at first. Then he understood. He reached into his jacket pocket. He found a scrap of newspaper that he had absent-mindedly picked up near the cabin and stuffed into his pocket without thinking. He unfolded it. Douglas Budget, dated October 9th. He looked east, where it was getting light. The sun was just rising. He hadn't lost 3 hours. He had lost a day and 3 hours. He sat on the crest of the hill and watched as they searched for his body below. The German shepherd picked up the scent from his truck, followed it to the clearing, stood at the edge, and began to whine. Morrison was saying something to Walter. Walter stood by the open truck door and looked out into the field. The man Harold had known for 35 years stood 100 yards away from him and didn't know he was alive. Harold wrote that he thought about this for a long time, about what would have happened if he had come down, what he would say to them, how he would explain where he had been. The gray room, faceless beings, days without memory. He imagined how it would sound. He imagined Morrison's face. He imagined what would happen next. A psychiatric evaluation, federal investigators, people who would want to know the details. He wrote one sentence about it. Those who want to know must not know, and those who can be trusted won't believe it anyway. He returned to the cabin. In the corner stood an old army thermos that he had left there several months ago. He'd taken it with him to the far corner of the... Next to it were 2 unlabeled tin cans, left behind from that same time. He had spent the whole day in the cabin. He heard the search party combing the area. They passed within 200 yards, no closer. They peeked inside briefly. He saw through a crack in the wall a man with a flashlight who shone it into the corner, stood there for a second, and moved on. At night he went out and headed west, not toward the farm, but the other way, toward the highway. He walked all night. The notebook ended almost at this point. The last few pages, scattered, disconnected phrases. I don't know if I came back, or if they just decided they didn't need me anymore. The Zippo stayed in the car. I didn't realize it until I got to the cabin, for the first time in 30 years. And the last line, at the very end of the last page, written in larger letters than the rest of the text. Don't look for me. Detective Holloway, having received the reports from the psychiatrist and the handwriting expert, sent inquiries to several agencies. The state sheriff's office reopened the case. Wanted notices were sent out to all states for a 76-year-old man, a Korean War veteran, with the following distinguishing features: a scar on his left forearm from a burn sustained in 1952, height 5 feet 11 inches, large build. Not a single response was received. Several specialists examined the notebook. A psychiatrist from Cheyenne, Dr. Rachel Montgomery, provided a detailed assessment. The text does not correspond to the clinical picture of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or dissociative amnesia. The narrative structure is too coherent, the details too specific, and the emotional tone restrained, lacking the elements of grandiosity or persecution typical of psychosis. Montgomery wrote cautiously, "The author describes her experiences in the same way that people with post-traumatic stress disorder describe real-life experiences. Fragmentarily, where it was painful, in detail, where it was important to record." Skeptics reacted predictably. A local newspaper quoted a psychology professor from the University of Wyoming, who explained it all as a dissociative episode stemming from chronic stress and loneliness. An elderly man living in isolation after his wife's death could have experienced an acute psychotic episode, left home in an altered state of consciousness, spent a day in an unknown location, and then sincerely believed what he had written. It sounded logical, almost convincing, until we returned to the physical evidence. A scorched circle with a flat bottom and a temperature of 1,700 degrees cannot be explained by a psychotic episode. 3 through holes in the wooden wall of the shed, punched at an angle from a point in the air above the field, cannot be explained. Iridium in the topsoil cannot be explained. A German shepherd that lost the trail in an open field cannot be explained. Nor can the Zippo lighter, which Harold Briggs had kept with him for 30 years, lying neatly in the open glove compartment of his truck, be explained. A psychotic episode leaves traces in the mind, not in the ground, and it doesn't make a man throw away in his car an item he'd carried with him since the Korean War. There were other inconsistencies that kept haunting Holloway. If Harold spent October 10th in the cabin, a search party of 30 people passed within 200 yards of it. One man peered inside. No one found him. That night, he set out on foot toward the west, toward Highway 25. The distance was about 12 miles. In the dark, across rough terrain, without food, after what had happened to him. He made it, because there was no alternative for him. One more thing kept troubling Holloway. The notebook was sent from Portland, Oregon. Harold had written that he was heading west. Portland is west. It all added up, but it was impossible to determine who had sent the package, Harold himself or someone else to whom he had given the notebook. No fingerprints were found on the envelope other than Dennis's. Not a single one. Either the envelope had been wiped clean, or whoever sealed it was wearing gloves. Neither scenario is typical of someone who simply decided to write a letter to his nephew. Holloway tried to find Harold Briggs for another 2 years or so. He searched databases across all the western states, hospitals, nursing homes, and social services. A query to the Department of Veterans Affairs turned up an old file on Harold Edward Briggs. The last entry was dated 1978. After that, not a single record of any contact with the system. Neither medical, nor administrative, nor tax-related. Harold Briggs has not appeared in any database even once since October 8, 1985. Holloway officially closed the active phase of the investigation in 2005. The case was shelved once again. The notebook was entered into the evidence registry and placed in the Wyoming State Sheriff's Office storage facility, where it remains to this day. Dennis Briggs died in 2014 of a heart attack. Shortly before his death, he gave his only in-depth interview to a small independent publication in Denver. He said he had reread the notebook many times, that he didn't know what to think, that his uncle had been a down-to-earth, practical man with no inclination toward fantasy. If someone else had written this, I'd say they were crazy. But this is Harold, and Harold didn't make things up. Walter Crane lived to be 81 and died in 2008. In his later years, he hardly ever spoke publicly about the case. The archives of that same Denver publication contain a short telephone conversation with him, recorded around 2005. The reporter asked if he believed what was written in the notebook. Walter paused and replied, "I saw that circle with my own eyes. I saw how Duke lost the trail in the open field. I saw his lighter in the glove compartment. Harold never left without his lighter. That's all I need." Briggs's farm changed hands twice after 1998. The third owner bought it in 2011. He located the site of the burned circle using old photographs from the case file. By that time, the grass had long since grown back, making it impossible to distinguish visually. He told a local newspaper that in the first 2 years after the purchase, he woke up several times at night to a low, monotonous hum. He listened. The hum stopped after a few minutes. He concluded it must be pipes or machinery on the neighboring property. Then the hum stopped and never returned. He added, almost in passing, that his border collie would sometimes go out into the yard at night and stand for a long time by the western fence, looking toward the lower pasture. No barking, no growling. She just stood there and watched. Then she would return to the house. He didn't think much of it. Dogs often behave strangely at night. They hear things we don't. Most likely some kind of nocturnal animal. Most likely. The case of the disappearance of Harold Edward Briggs remains open in the Converse County Sheriff's Office archives to this day. Harold Briggs has not been found, neither alive nor dead. None of the proposed theories explains the physical evidence as a whole. The notebook exists. The handwriting has been confirmed. Who sent the package from Portland in 2003 remains unknown.